The Tunnels, Part 3, by T. Kroll, 1113. "Paul!" he called out again, this time louder. I heard it again. The water was moving. It was moving. "Climb over the top," I said as I turned to him. "What? Why?" "It's coming. Climb over the top. Go!" Mark slung the shotgun onto his back and started scrambling. With the ear protection, I could hear it running. Panicking, I started up the pile of dust and broken cement behind him. My left hand grabbed onto something sticky and grimy. The blood wasn't quite dry yet. Bill's blood adhered to my skin with a thick layer of dirt. I watched Mark's face as he turned over the top and pushed himself off into the black emptiness that waited to greet us. I reached the peak of the tiny mountain, and just as I started down the other side, there was a terrible pain in the back of my head as something sharp burrowed into my skull. The flesh parted into an aching crevice as I screamed and pushed against the debris with my legs. Flying backwards to the floor, I slammed onto the cement and unloaded. Bang! The first shot went off, then the second, the third. With every pull of the trigger, there was another breath of vengeful flame from the muzzle of my rifle. Broken chips of concrete rained on me from above as I fired round after round into the darkness. Something moved in the light of my rifle. I kept shooting, and I didn't stop until there was nothing left. My hair was resting in a warm puddle of blood that started to form around my skull. When the firing stopped, there was a terrible, ear-piercing noise all around me. I hit it. I had to have. I hit it, and I wounded it. The noise was unbearable. It must be dying. I jumped to my feet. "Mark! Mark, I got it!" There was no answer. Only the shrieking cry of a dying creature. "Mark!" I called again. "Mark!" I yelled for him. The weapon light illuminating over 24 impact craters in the ceiling above me. The adrenaline coursed through my body as I hit the mag release, dropped the empty one to the floor amidst the scattered brass casings. Taking another magazine from my belt, I reloaded before pointing the rifle back up towards the gap. Slowly, I stepped backwards. I felt the bolt jump forward when I slammed the side of the rifle with the palm of my hand, ready to empty another mag into that thing. But it didn't come. I got it. I had to have gotten it. A hand touched my shoulder. I spun around. "Why didn't you answer me?" I said. I looked at him. In the ambient light from the rifle, I could make out that his face was moving. He was talking, but all I could hear was a terrible shrieking. No, not shrieking. Ringing. With my left hand, I reached up to inspect the wound. I winced as my fingers graced the side of the gash and followed it up towards the top of my head. The ear protection was gone. I looked back to see them resting towards the top of the pile. The headband was streaked with wet blood. I looked back to Mark. The ringing had begun to fade, but he didn't sound right. He was muffled, and I couldn't make out the words. It was like he was trying to talk to me through a wall. "Mark, I think I'm deaf," I said. He stopped talking. He snapped his fingers by my ears, and I shook my head no. The sound barely registered. 30 rounds of 5.56 millimeter into a cement hallway is far from quiet. Mark had been further down the hall. With his left ear plugged, he managed to get away with only a slight ringing. I walked back to the pile and I grabbed my ears. Walking back down the hallway, I handed them to Mark without stopping. If the microphone in them still worked, at least he had a half-decent chance of hearing it coming. Taking a moment to look around me. This room was about 20 by 40 feet. There were some scattered shovels and a wheelbarrow, with the remains of what at one time was a rubber tire draped over the steel rim of its front wheel. There were more steel water drums. These were still sealed. At the opposite end of the room was another set of double doors, unobstructed. I looked back to Mark and then continued through the room and past the doorway. I wondered as I walked down the hall, following the obvious trail of footprints deep in the thick blanket of dust on the tunnel floor, if I would ever hear again. Did that matter? It was already dark down here. If the lights died, I would never make it out anyway. My thoughts were not comforting. I turned off the weapon light, and from my pocket I pulled the headlamp that I had used when we first began our expedition. It wasn't nearly as bright, but the batteries should last for hours. Mark came up behind me and stopped. He pulled on my bag. Once he held up his hand for me to stop. Twice he motioned as if to run. 3 times he held up the shotgun and pretended to fire into the dark. I nodded and kept going, trying to get myself accustomed to the silence that I would likely endure for the rest of my life. We walked for several minutes. Every so often, I would look back down to make sure that we were still following the trail. Eventually, we came to a doorway on our right. The prints moved on ahead and then doubled back to here and turned down this second hallway. I looked back again. Mark was still there. I shined my weapon light down the long, dark tunnel behind us, illuminating the dust that hung lightly in the air as we disturbed it on our walk. We then headed down this new path before us. We moved slowly. On the right again, there were multiple offshoots to this tunnel. All of them were sealed from floor to ceiling by who knows how many tons of stone. On our left, there were several large storage rooms. Each one had long ago been emptied. The footprints continued on past them. Paul had elected not to explore these. Ahead, the tunnel was coming to a T-junction. To the right, more stone blocking the path. But the floor here was damp. My heart began racing again. I climbed up to the top of the doorway and poked my head through. We had reached the end of the building, and all along the crumbling exterior wall, groundwater was seeping in. There had to be at least a few inches of water down there, flowing away from me towards what I assumed was the flooded chamber. Along the ceiling, there were the remains of fluorescent light fixtures. The lamps had been shattered. The hair stood up on the back of my neck, electrified with terrified anticipation as my eyes fell down towards the gnarled, terrified expression on Bill's face. The remains of his body, partially submerged in the gently flowing stream that had carved its way through a foot of aging concrete before taking up residence down here in the dark. Around him were countless bones. Most were from small animals. My eyes found the upper portion of a human skull. The brain cavity was ripped open. I jumped back. The room around me was brighter than before. Turning around, with relief, I saw Paul. He was covered in sweat and dirt. He emerged from the unexplored hallway my back had been turned to. He had armed himself with a rusted 4-foot length of steel rebar. For a few minutes, we stood there. He tried talking to me. I guessed that Mark was explaining to him that he was wasting his breath. I watched Mark hand him the spare earplugs. He spoke and Paul shook his head no. They went back and forth while I stood nervously and impatiently, occasionally turning my gaze back to the damp floor behind me, then up towards the top of the doorway. Mark took out his phone and began typing before handing it to me. No way out down this hall. Must go back. Paul found doorway leading to outside. Blocked. 3 of us might be able to get open. I handed the phone back to him and started back down the hallway, retracing our steps in the agonizingly quiet darkness. Paul must have doubled back when he couldn't get out. Again, passing the dark storage rooms, this time on our right, we finally came back to the main hallway of this section. Right was hopefully salvation. Left, well, left wasn't something that I wanted to think about. As we got to the corner, I looked back to Mark and Paul before shining my light to the right, where we had to go. There was nothing. I pulled back, hit the switch again, and looked to the left. Again, nothing. Nothing but our dusty footprints. I walked down the hall, occasionally glancing back to my friends. Their haggard appearances surely had to be better than my own. My neck felt sticky and filthy. The bleeding had stopped, but not before running down my back and adhering the soft cotton t-shirt to my skin. It wasn't long before we came to the end of the hall, a set of double doors with no handle, and no visible locking mechanism. But around the edges and down the center, sunlight was creeping in. We had found a way out. The doors opened outwards. Paul slammed hard into them, but the doors wouldn't move. I was bigger, 6'4", with more than a few pounds to spare. I pounded against the door with all of the strength that I could muster, throwing my weight against the steel, and I felt it give. I nearly lost my balance when the door started to move, but fortunately, I caught myself against it. As sunlight illuminated the narrow path down the middle of the hall, I looked back up to see the door had only moved about an inch, just enough for the sunlight to start creeping in. Outside, we could see the door had been barricaded and locked up with 2 heavy lengths of chain, joined by an aging padlock. Again we stood, and again I tried without success to make out the muffled words they shared as they went back and forth about how to proceed. I didn't want to speak. I didn't know how loud I would be, unable to hear myself. So I stood patiently at the doors, looking out on a poorly kept field of overgrown grass that extended out towards the countless oaks and the shade of the forest. The door opened out to the federal land local hunters and teenage drinkers would frequent. Maybe while we sat trapped here, someone would happen to walk by. It was unlikely, but not impossible. I checked my cell phone. We were at the end of the tunnel, practically outside, but there was still no signal. I began to type. There were some tools in the room back at the end of the hall. Maybe something to pry, to force the doors open. I showed it to them. Paul shook his head. He didn't want to go back, and I didn't blame him. Mark stood for a moment, looking at the phone, and finally nodded his head at me before turning to walk back down the tunnel into the darkness. Paul stayed behind by the doors as we slowly disappeared out of sight. All that could be made out of us was the light of our headlamps, and then finally, nothing. We were gone and he was all alone, just inches from freedom. After a while, we came back to the offshoot and I shined my rifle light down to see our footprints, haphazardly crisscrossing one another, and then we continued on. Finally, I could see the doorway. We were nearly back to the room. I looked up. The tunnel ceiling had 12-foot fluorescent light fixtures, fastened every few feet to the gray concrete ceiling. The lamps were intact, but likely burnt out decades ago, assuming that there was even any power down here. The white fixtures that housed them were beginning to give way to the rot, and reddish-brown cracks split the pale white finish, giving way to gaps of varying sizes. The soft dust underfoot gave way to the weight of my boots as near-perfect imprints trailed behind me, while I followed our steps back towards the room. I shined my weapon light in, and quickly turned from one side of the room to the other, then slowly back. Back to the blood-stained pile of broken cinder blocks, poking out from years of dirt and dust. Back to the small pile of red, moist dust that had been kicked up around my feet when I jumped back to finish my attacker. It wasn't here. We paced back and forth across the room, looking for what was left behind. There wasn't much. Certainly not much that we would find useful. I took an old spade with a dried-up wooden shaft, sighed with disappointment, and shrugged to Mark. This was the best thing I found. I started to walk back to the doorway when I noticed that Mark was still poking his head around. A rusty steel pick had been on the floor by the wheelbarrow. I should have looked harder. Tools in hand, we started walking back again. We passed the tunnel where we had found Paul and kept going for a few more feet When I stopped, something was different. My heart started beating faster. I crouched down and placed the shovel on the floor before reaching for the grip of my rifle, squeezing the pressure switch on the rail above the barrel to light up the path ahead. Nothing. There was nothing ahead of us. Why was my heart racing? Why was I starting to sweat? I certainly didn't hear anything. What was making every receptor in my brain cry out in danger, telling me that something was wrong? I paused on the ground, looking behind me to see Mark. He was confused. He didn't know why I stopped. What reason could I have? We already saw that there was nothing ahead. Why did my instincts tell me to stop? Something had changed. Something was wrong. Something about this tunnel was different than before. But there was some kind of disconnect in my brain. I couldn't place my finger on why, on what it was. Why was I so afraid? My mind raced. My heart rate soared. What was it? Then finally, the circuit clicked into place and was coursing at full power in my nerve-racked consciousness. The smell. The tunnel was dry. It smelled like an old attic or basement, but stronger. The smell of years of parched emptiness had filled the tunnels and clung to us like a musty perfume. I had smelled it most of the day, and the smell was much stronger now without my hearing. It was powerful and assaulted my olfactory nerves relentlessly. But now, it had a friend. A new odor, one of dampness, a smell of stagnant water and musk. It was here in the dark with us, hunting us from the shadows. No doubt following the scent of dried blood that permeated from the stains on my neck and clothes, from the open wound stretching down the back of my head. I was starting to shake. There was a thud. It was muffled, sort of like holding your ear to the door as someone hit the other side with the palm of their hand. Then there was another. This time I noticed the flash. Mark was shooting. A third blast. He had 2 shots left. I couldn't turn. I couldn't bear to. He had to grab me by the shirt collar and drag me to get me to run. And run we did, sprinting down the tunnel for what seemed like ages. Finally, sunlight came back into view. We were almost to the doors. Mark reached them first. I could hear him faintly, yelling at Paul, but I couldn't make out the words. I watched Paul stick the earplugs in and start shoving the door, throwing himself against it again and again as Mark turned back to face me. He was loading more shells into the shotgun before he clicked on the light at the end of the barrel. It blinded me as he raised the barrel, staring back through me. I passed him, and running at full speed, I slammed into the door with everything I had. It moved another few inches. The barricade was moving, but the chain still held us back. There was a flash around me, and another thud resonated through my battered ear canal. Mark was shooting again. I pulled back from the door and fired my rifle at the lock. After several shots, it finally started to give way, and Paul and I slammed again and again into the doors as the tunnel around us flashed with gunfire, before I finally fell through the gap and back out into the world. Paul helped me up as we ran out to the edge of the woods. This time, we wouldn't run away. This time, we would stay. I wasn't leaving a friend behind in that dark, silent hell a second time. 10 feet from the door, I stopped myself sliding into the dirt, and I turned back around to face it, but it wasn't there. The doors were now wide open. Sunlight bathed the first 10 feet or so of the tunnel. There was nothing. No creature. No Mark. I looked around. He must have run out beside us. He was right there, right next to us. I know he was. But the only person standing there with me was a terrified and breathless Paul. I looked back to the tunnel entrance, surrounded by no trespassing signs, danger, keep out. They were everywhere. We stood there for over an hour. Paul kept pulling on my arms to get me to move, but I refused. Either Mark would walk out, or it would. But still, nothing came. Somewhere in the blackness of the tunnels, it waited. The broken bulbs made sense now. It didn't care for the light. That's why it didn't follow us up the ladder. It crushed the lantern when it came for Bill. Whatever it was, the darkness was its home. I paced back and forth in front of the entrance for a while. Once I even got close enough to the tunnel entrance to shine the light in. On the floor, in the dust, about 20 feet from the doors, was the shotgun. Mark was gone. I picked up the gun and walked back out to the forest. There was no point going into the tunnels a third time. My best friend was dead. There were questions. His family filed a missing persons report, and all of his coworkers had to be interviewed. I didn't know what to tell the police. It was Paul's idea to say that we left, but Mark and Bill went back to take more measurements, and we hadn't seen them since. The lie was painful to tell. There were animal attacks across the county, more than usual. When 2 college girls went missing, I had had enough and started packing. I got a new job on the other side of the state, and we left. With hearing aids, I can usually carry on a conversation. But now, my wife is always quick to point out that I'm always just a little too loud. The outside of our new house is covered in security lighting. Every day at dusk, the lights kick on, and every morning at dawn, they turn back off. The hallway light outside my bedroom is permanently on. I bypassed the light switch so no one could shut it off. In my closet, 5 feet from my bed, hidden beneath a pile of clothes, is a loaded rifle, just in case. I got a phone call from my old boss today, who I haven't spoken to in over a year. Paul was dead. Someone broke into the second floor window during the night and ripped his family to shreds. The police couldn't tell if it was a homicide or an animal attack. There would be a closed casket service sometime the following week. Something was trapped down there in those tunnels. Something vicious and hungry that was forgotten by the rest of the world. Something that we let out. Just after dusk, the lights kicked on and my yard looked like a small airport under the bright LEDs fixed under every corner of the roof. I sat on the couch of the living room with my wife, reading an article from one of the local news sites about Paul's family. One daughter was staying with a friend, the other 2 were gone, along with his wife. My wife sat quietly next to me, solemnly resting her head against my shoulder as she watched the TV, trying not to pay attention to my phone. Suddenly, she jumped. "What?" I asked her. She didn't answer. She looked outside to the yard. It was dark. One of the lights had gone out, and just on the edge of the light shining down from the next fixture, I saw it mangled on the lawn. Suddenly, that went out too. Then the next one went out, and then the next. It had found me.